Good evening. I'm Terry Anderson. Where are they? Get up here. You're supposed to be up here. Okay. That's my husband, Steve. My brother, Jerry, his wife, Lorraine, Rochelle Miller, and Sam Miller. We want to thank everyone for attending this inaugural event, and a special welcome to our speaker, Deborah Lipstadt, we look forward to hearing from you shortly. The world has changed. Anti-Semitism continues to rise at an alarming rate. While gun violence and mass casualty events have become all too commonplace, less than a year after the worst anti-Semitic attack ever at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the Youngstown Area Jewish Federation learned a credible local threat of gun violence by a self-proclaimed anti-Semitite and a white supremacist against our community. Thankfully, law enforcement intervened, but the experience was both frightening and telling, and further proof of our increased security needs and the importance of the work done through the Jewish Community Relations Council and all of our Federation agencies, all of which is supported by our annual campaign. The inaugural event has never been open to the general community. However, given today's reality as well as the caliber of our presenter, we knew it was imperative to invite good friends to our Federation and Jewish community to tonight's event. We'd like to welcome many special guests tonight. Students and professors from YSU and Kent State, local officials, faith leaders, and leaders in the greater Youngstown area community. Thank you to the Federation campaign staff and the JCC's program team for their assistance in putting together tonight's event. Many staff members of Federation and its agencies are here tonight. You can read more about the agencies and how your generous donations are used in the brochure you received tonight with your program.
We hope you all had a chance to enjoy the young musicians who provided the music for our cocktail hour. These children are students of the JCC School of Music and highlighted just one of the many special programs offered in our community. We are privileged to serve as members of the inaugural event host committee as a way to honor our fathers who were Holocaust survivors. At this time, we'd like to ask all those here tonight who are children or grandchildren of Holocaust survivors to stand as we take a moment to recognize the deep impact survivors and their lasting legacy have had in our community. Our community is a community of survivors in so many ways. Tonight in the lobby, you were able to experience some of our survivors' stories. Now we'd like to delve deeper into just a few of the stories of those who have made such an impact on our local families and community. Please turn your attention to video produced by JCC and JCRC board member Talia Hagler.
He endured horrible things.
I don't know how he survived it.
You know, he started falling asleep on the job at 11 years old, and they beat him with a rubber hose.
With the years, I understand the enormity of this.
She never forgot the look of anguish on her mother's face.
Our father was born in Lodz, Poland, and they lived a very comfortable life. They would travel, and they had a nanny or a housekeeper, but he said life was very good.
She was born in 1925 in Berlin, which was at that time a very thriving cultural city.
He basically lived a normal life. He had a normal childhood, a very close-knit family. He had 6 siblings.
My father grew up in Poland. He was one of 7 children, and he was the youngest.
So when my mother was 8, Hitler came to power, and then things gradually deteriorated until there was Kristallnacht in November of 1938, when the Nazis burned synagogues and looted Jewish businesses, and at that time the writing was on the wall.
Now, they didn't really feel anything till he was about 12. So things were happening, and the family eventually ended up, of course, in a ghetto.
In like 1939, things started to get bad, so they were told to leave.
He left Poland before 1939. He left in 1936 to join, to go with the youth movement to live in Russia in what became like a type of a kibbutz, like a prep to go to Israel.
When they ended up leaving the ghetto and getting onto the trains, his mother and sister and younger brother, 2 younger brothers, went, to the side you don't want to go to. And he and his brothers and father, went the other direction.
In 1939, my mother and her sister were put on a train going to England. The British government was kind enough to take in 10,000 Jewish children. Most of the children that went on the Kindertransport did not see their parents again. Kindertransport is the German word for child transport, and that's exactly, they were saved because they were able to go to England.
He was a machinist, and we volunteered at the work camp. He was making bullets for the Germans, and like I say, they did that for 2.5 years, and then they were transported to Buchenwald, where he spent the last, actually from January to April, he spent there.
He was with his brother and his father prior to January, and then in January he was separated from them.
In 1939, when the news came that Poland was occupied, he tried to get back home, but he couldn't. The people who were part of this group became prisoners. Eventually, what happened was that everybody who was a political prisoner and they were on the list were sentenced and were sent to Siberia.
For a while there, he actually was with his brothers and father, and they, of course, got on the train and they were taken to a work camp, and basically that's what he did. He saw people dying right in front of him, the food, not much of it around, people getting shot. He got hit a lot because he couldn't withstand the weight of the rocks that needed to be moved from one area to another area.
My mom lived with her uncle, her aunt, and a couple of cousins. And she tells stories of bombing raids, in London, nights that were spent on the subway platform, where they could be protected, and it was a time of war. And then the war ended in 1945.
And then the Americans came in and liberated him, April 11th, 1945.
He stayed, because he was a child, he stayed in Buchenwald for a few months afterwards.
So you're free to go. He said, where am I going to go? He was 14 years old, 15 years old.
So my father ended up in Siberia until Stalin died in 1954, I believe, and it took them 2 more years to get paperwork, bureaucracy, to get out, to move back to a place where they could live.
He told himself that he wanted to get through this, and with his faith, which was very important, he ended up getting through this horrible time.
She finally ended up in Los Angeles, where she was reunited with her parents 8.5 years after they were separated.
He survived because he was lucky enough to be in Siberia, which was hard labor, but that's one way of surviving.
He didn't talk about it when we were little. As we got older, he did talk about it, and I think it came back. He was afraid that people would forget, and he wanted that story to be told.
I think the most important thing is, as the years go by, we don't have survivors to tell the true stories and the journeys that people went through.
The Federation's work is extremely important because it provides the opportunity for someone like myself to tell these stories so they're preserved and can be presented to future generations in years to come. And I think that's extremely important because we're a people of memory and we're a people of hope. And you don't have the memories if you can't transmit them.
The Federation has helped to bring the stories to life. If these stories can be told and if they can educate one person then that person maybe will tell it to other people.
The Federation's annual campaign provides the crucial amount of support that we need to do this work. Without the work of the campaign staff and all of the great volunteers and every donor in this community to the campaign, we could not do this work. It supports our staff person who does this work out in the community. It supports the work of the JCRC. It supports the work of putting together exhibitions and films and going out into the community and forging these partnerships in sponsoring teacher educational programs or individual educators and students to participate in other communities or other organizations' programs. None of this work could happen without the support of all of our donors to our annual campaign. If we didn't do this important work of Holocaust remembrance and education, I think we'd be losing out on the core mission of who we are as a Jewish community.
I just wanted to thank everybody for keeping our fathers and so many other survivors' stories alive. I know my father for sure loved Youngstown, and he really got such satisfaction from going to schools and making a difference in children's lives. It's because of your gifts to the Federation campaign that we are able to ensure lifelong legacy. It's now our honor to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt. Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, DeRote Professor of Holocaust Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, is the author of 6 books and numerous articles. She is probably most widely known because of the libel lawsuit brought against her by David Irving for having called him a Holocaust denier. Irving then was arguably the world's leading denier. After a 10-week trial in London, in an overwhelming victory for Professor Lipstadt, the judge found Irving to be a neo-Nazi polemicist who perverts history and engages in racist and an anti-Semitic discourse. The movie Denial, which many of you I'm sure have seen, tells the story of this legal battle and is based on her book, History on Trial, My Day in Court with the Holocaust Denier, and recently reissued as Denial. The film was nominated for a BAFTA as one of the best British films of the year. At Emory, she directs the website known as HDOT, Holocaust Denial on Trial, which contains a complete archive of the proceedings of Irving versus Penguin UK and Deborah Lipstadt. It also provides answers to frequent claims made by deniers. Professor Lipstadt was an historical consultant to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and helped design the section of the museum dedicated to the American response to the Holocaust. She was held presidential appointment to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council from Presidents Clinton and Obama, and was asked by President George W. Bush to represent the White House at the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. She was part of a committee that advised Secretary of State Madeleine Albright on matters of religious freedom abroad. With all of that, I am so honored to introduce our speaker, Deborah Lipstadt.
It's a pleasure being here. I've gotten, in the couple of hours since I arrived, I've had an intense tour of Youngstown, of the facilities at the Federation, Jewish Community Center, et cetera, et cetera. I even got to watch a violin lesson. And then to see the very moving and educational exhibits, outside, and then to watch this very powerful film. It reminds us that, but 80 years ago, 1 out of every 3 Jews on the face of the earth was murdered. And of course, the Nazis did not just commit the Holocaust, the murder of the Jews, or the attempted murder of the Jews across all of Europe and beyond, Rhodes, Libya, etc. But they also went after other people, certainly anyone they deemed to be handicapped or genetically deficient in some way in Germany, gays in Germany. And had they won, they probably would have eliminated millions of other people, Mongols, as many as Ukrainians as they could, Lithuanians, Latvians, etc., just leaving enough to produce food for them. But only in the case of the Jews did it have to be done comprehensively right away. And the fact that there were survivors to tell us their story in the first person. I know there are many teachers here, and I'm sure those of you who teach about this topic, who have brought survivors into your classroom, something that is exceptionally difficult today, if not impossible in many places, know that you can teach a terrific course, but when you bring in the person who can say, this is my story, this is what happened to me, what a difference it makes. I know that from personal experience. My mother was born in Canada, but her family came to Detroit. Her parents came from Poland early in the 20th century, and she was from a large family, and between the oldest child and the youngest child, there were about 12 years, and she was the next to youngest. And her older sister married and moved to Cincinnati. And as you well know, Cincinnati is a very southern city, and my 2 cousins, who are 15 years older than I am, 14 years older than I am, grew up in Cincinnati, and one of the people who worked for my grandfather in what was really what they called the junkyard, today it would be called a metal reclamations facility, but a junkyard. One of the gentlemen who worked there had been born a slave on a plantation. I believe his name was Charlie Johnson. And he would take my cousin sometimes to visit some friends of his in the neighborhood. He had been very young, but there were some people who had been older who remembered more. And one woman in particular who sang for them songs that she had learned when she had been enslaved on this plantation. So there are cousins of mine who are but 14 and 15 years older than I am, for whom slavery in the United States is something they know in the first person singular, having heard it from these people. For me, no matter how much I study about it or relate to it, it is something of the 19th century with deep-seated legacies for well over 100 years thereafter. But there's a difference when you can put a name and a face on it, as is the case with survivors of the Holocaust. So I'm deeply grateful, and grateful for those who put together this very powerful video. But tonight I come to speak to you about something that is really less related to the history I do and more related to a contemporary situation, and that is the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of hatred, the rise of prejudice in our country and in other countries. And on some level, the British have a term they use, they call gobsmacked. Gobsmacked is like hitting the head, what? Many of us are gobsmacked that but a couple of decades after the Holocaust, and that this is happening again, that this is being expressed again. Where did this come from? What is it? So in the next about 40 minutes, I'd like to take you through some of that exposition. What is it? How do we understand it? Where is it coming from? And what possibly might we do about it? Now, people often debate the definition of anti-Semitism. One novelist, I think a Hungarian novelist, described it, an anti-Semite, as someone who hates Jews more than is absolutely necessary. And it's amusing, but if you think about it, it really makes sense. I can hate you, but if I hate you because maybe you did something wrong to me, or maybe I just don't like you, it may be rational, it may be irrational, it doesn't matter. But if I hate you one iota more because you're a Jew, or you're African American, or you're a gay person, or LGBTQ, whatever it might be, that's prejudice. Hate is not. Hate's bad, but hate is not. Hating you because of what you are, that's prejudice. Some people say about anti-Semitism, they quote what I think would be the most famous line to ever emerge from the United States Supreme Court, and that is from Justice Potter Stewart in the 1960s. He was ruling on an obscenity case about a Louis Malle film, whether it was pornographic or not, and he said of pornography, "I may not be able to define it, but I know it when I see it." And for many people, that's the same thing for Jews vis-a-vis anti-Semitism, for African Americans, Hispanics vis-a-vis racism, etc., etc. But there actually is a way of identifying anti-Semitism, of looking at it, the stereotypes that are associated with it. Remember, every prejudice, every form of prejudice, it doesn't matter against what group or who, has certain particular stereotypes, hateful stereotypes, that have become associated with it. And you don't move stereotype from one group to another because it doesn't make sense. What are the stereotypes associated with Jews? Well, usually there are 3 or 4. One is something to do with money. 2, intellect, but not positive intellect, cunning. A level of cunning, a level of using their smarts in a nefarious way. And a power way above their weight, to accomplish their goals for their own benefit, doesn't matter how it affects other people. And so it's the money, the power, the cunning, usually those are the central elements. And there is one other thing about it as well, and that is that and it comes out to a certain extent from what happened, or the way Jewish-Christian relations evolved in the Middle Ages, when the church was quite intent, certainly in the early Middle Ages and through most of the Middle Ages, on separating itself from Judaism and from Jews, and of denigrating Jews, to differentiate, to show that Christianity superseded, this is called supersessionism in Christian theology, superseded Judaism and was an improvement on, and the Jews who refused to see this were obstinate and blind, etc., etc. In fact, one of the statues that survived the horrific fire at the Cathedral of Notre Dame is the statue of Iglesia, the church, and Synagoga, the synagogue. And the church statue the woman is quite beautiful and put together, and the statue of the woman representing Synagoga, first of all, she's completely disheveled. She is blindfolded because she doesn't see the truth. She has a snake wrapped around her, etc. So this is that depiction. But that led to this idea that the Jew was akin to the devil. In other words, a Jew didn't just have to be hated, as is often the case with many prejudices and many stereotypical prejudices, but the Jew had to be feared for what they might do, that the Jew was part of a conspiracy theory. Or that the Jew was part of a conspiracy, and anti-Semitism has that element of a conspiracy theory. That they are not just that you don't like them and you don't want them around, but they're dangerous. They can do bad things. And on top of it, this also grew out of that relationship in the Middle Ages, and it meanders way outside of the church over the centuries. That the Jew, just like the demon or the devil, couldn't be recognized or could disguise himself so that you couldn't recognize him or her, and so you couldn't protect yourself against the damage they might do. They would poison the wells, they would desecrate the host in the church, they would kill Christian children. Whatever the outrageous kind of idea was, that you couldn't protect yourself. So it's a conspiracy theory, cunning, powerful, dangerous. Now, how does it compare? Let's compare it just as a prejudice to another horrific prejudice prevalent in our country, and not just in our country, racism. The racist looks at the person of color, black person, brown person, and says, if they move into our neighborhoods, they'll bring down the neighborhoods. If their children go to our children's school, they'll ruin the school. They'll take us down because they're lesser than us. Think back to the 1936 Olympics. And Americans who have a devastating sense of history, when you say to them 1936 Olympics, even those who don't know which came first, World War I or World War II, do you count backwards, you count forwards, will know one name associated with the 1936 Olympics, and that is Jesse Owens. So the Nazis had to explain to the so-called Aryan, it's a made-up term, it has no basis in science, but the pure German, how was it possible that this African American was able to win, to achieve this incredible athletic feat? And you can spell feat either way, and with Jesse Owens you'd be right. How was he able to beat the Aryans? And what did they say? They say, well, he's a black man, and on their pseudo-scientific, nothing to do with science, but pseudo-scientific scale of evolutionary development, a black man was closer to an animal than to a human. So they said it's not a fair match, because he is closer to an animal than... So in other words, they had to bring him down. And that's part of the legacy of racism, whether it was calling an African American man who could be 60 years old boy, or whatever it was. You looked at the person of color, the racist looks at the person of color and punches down. They're lesser and I have to keep them down. The anti-Semite, who is generally the same person as the racist, you're not talking about two different people. The anti-Semite looks at the Jew and says the Jew is smaller in number, but more powerful, richer, cunning, conniving, and more dangerous. The anti-Semite punches up. So the Jew is not just hated, but feared for the danger they can cause. Now, there are different kinds of anti-Semites. We all recognize, just as again comparing to racism, the different kinds of racists. There's the extremist, the person who marches down the street in a Nazi-like uniform, who engages in a Hitlerian salute, who marches through Charlottesville, Virginia, through the town where the University of Virginia is, founded by Thomas Jefferson, chanting, "Jews will not replace us," with tiki torches that were made famous by Nazi propaganda marches and Nazi party marches. It was not by chance that they chose tiki torches. That's the extremists. It's just like, again, with the racists. If someone were to show up in a white robe, in a white kind of headgear, you wouldn't recognize them as Ku Klux Klan. We know those people. They're dangerous, but their danger to some degree is mitigated by the fact that we recognize them. But there are many other kinds of anti-Semites. There is what I call the dinner party anti-Semite. The dinner party anti-Semite, someone who would never think of going on a march like that, who would never think of doing anything extreme, but who says at dinner, "Oh, my firm just hired a nice new young associate. He's a Jew, but he's very honest." That's anti-Semitism. And it can happen again with some of the other prejudices I've mentioned. In fact, other than my trial, and I shouldn't say other than, it took 8 years of my life and brought me very close contact with different kinds of anti-Semitism, but prior to that, one of the few encounters, I had 2 direct encounters with anti-Semitism. One happened when I was quite young, I don't know, 8, 9 years old. I went into a store, I think my memory says it was a hardware store, I don't know. I don't remember specifically, with my father. Now my father, we grew up in a modern Orthodox home. My father did not wear a kippah on the street, he wore a hat. He was a very distinguished gentleman, and you didn't walk around in those days with kippot, you walked around with a hat. But somehow the owner of the hardware store knew my father was Jewish. It's possible he was buying something to build a sukkah, or he was the booth used at tabernacles, or he was buying something to fix something at the synagogue where we were active members, whatever it might have been. And the man said to my father very proudly, "Oh, Mr. Lipstadt, you know, some of my best friends are Jews." And when we walked out of the store, I said, "Isn't that nice, Daddy, that some of his best friends are Jews?" And my father said something which I didn't fully understand then, but I do now. He said, "You'll never hear someone boast, some of my best friends are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The minute someone is boasting about some of my best friends are," and you can fill in the blank, whatever it might be, they're saying, "Oh, look at me, I'm so terrific, I'm friendly with those people." Or, "I'm friendly with the good ones." It's a form of prejudice, even though it is said positively. Or, another incident that happened to me in my life, my first academic job was at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I was the first person at that university to have the word Jewish in their title. Today you have Professor of Jewish Studies. I've met a couple of them from local university in Kent State, others, but then it was unique. It was not common, put it that way. And I was hired as a professor of modern Jewish history. Now remember, this is the days before email, before internet, etc., etc. So I come from my first year and everything goes very well. I teach classes, they're heavily enrolled, students of all types and all backgrounds, all outlooks, etc. are taking the courses, I'm writing, I'm an active participant in the department, all is going terrifically. Towards the end of the year, one of my colleagues takes me out, says, "Deborah, let's go out for coffee." So we go out for coffee, and he says to me, this is a senior person in the department, he says, "You know, I was on leave last year and outside of Seattle when this position was being decided upon, was being defined, and then advertised, and the candidates brought in, and someone selected." He said, I knew nothing about the whole process because I was away. Today, of course, you could easily be kept abreast of things. And he said, so when I came back and I heard that our department had hired first of all, created a position for Jewish studies and had hired a New Yorker, a woman, a Jew, I was appalled. I said, what did we get ourselves into? Then he paused and he said, "But Deborah, you're the best thing to ever happen to this department." And to my enduring shame, I just drank my coffee, tried not to choke on it, but what I should have said is that's one of the most anti-Semitic things that's ever been said to me. In other words, I didn't fit the stereotype that he assumed would be the case of a New York Jewish woman. And so that you can have anti-Semitism, just like you can have racism, that comes across as an affirming thing, but is hardly that. You're different, you're better, I'm better because I'm friends with you, you didn't live up to the stereotype. Then you have anti-Semitic enablers. And that's what we see a lot of today. And we see it on the left, the political left, and we see it on the political right. That's, again, a relatively unique aspect of anti-Semitism compared to other prejudices, is that it's both on the right and the left. How does it manifest itself? And about the anti-Semitic enablers, I don't ask the question whether the person is an anti-Semite or not. And in fact, that's often, that's a dead end to debate whether someone is an anti-Semite or not, because you'll never get any place. The question is, irrespective of what they are, what do they cause by their actions? And we see on both the right and the left people who, whether they are anti-Semites or not, I'm not sure. I may have private opinion, but I can't prove it one way or the other. But I see their actions enabling anti-Semitism. So on the far right, and again, I'm bringing Coles to Newcastle to talk about it in this community, particularly with the incident, or the almost incident you had but a couple of weeks ago. But again, going back to Pittsburgh, Tree of Life Synagogue, which will, in about a month, will be a year, or the synagogue in San Diego, or the man arrested here in Youngstown, or someone arrested in Arkansas not long ago, and in many other places. Many of the people I'm talking about in these cases were of the far right, white supremacists, white racists, white nationalists, use whatever term you want. And though they are certainly racist, there's no question about it, they are also intertwined with that is deep-seated anti-Semitism. What was the man, the murderer, whose name I know but I'm not going to mention, in Pittsburgh yelling as the SWAT team was bringing him down, "You will not destroy the white race." He was yelling that at the Jews in the synagogue. To him, the Jews were not white. They're not white at all. Or the murderer in San Diego, and people sometimes call the writings that they left manifestos. I wouldn't give them that credit. It's garbled garbage, but it's garbage filled with hate. But the same thing, rantings about the destruction of the white race. What is that about? And it's the same thing with in Charlottesville. The Jews will not replace us. This is a manifestation of what's called white replacement theory, or white Christian replacement theory. And it goes as follows, that there is a concerted effort. You can go on don't go on their websites, but if you really want to check it out, you can go on these websites. Let me do it for you. You know, they're horrific. But there is a theory amongst the white nationalist supremacists, etc., that there is a plan, an organized plan, to replace white Christian culture with black people from Africa, from the Middle East, with brown people from south of the American border. But these people, in quotation marks, remember punching down, are not smart enough, are not talented enough to plan this on their own. This is being manipulated behind the scenes. This is being contrived behind the scenes. This is being done by unseen handlers. We can't see them, but we know who they are, the Jew. Therefore, in Pittsburgh, he's yelling, you won't bring down the white race. So it's that conspiracy theory, that white replacement theory, with the Jew as the manipulating force behind it. On the progressive left, and I'm not talking about everyone on the progressive left, certainly, but when it manifests itself on the left, we see this particularly, but not only in the British Labour Party, we see that on many campuses as well. It manifests itself somewhat differently. The anti-Semitism is the same. It's the same stereotypes that I've mentioned a number of times this evening, but it comes from a different root. The person on the progressive left who is an anti-Semite, his or her view of the world is refracted through a prism. And if you remember your Physics 101, a prism bends light, it shapes how you see things. And that prism has a number of facets. And one facet is ethnicity. One facet is economic privilege, and one facet is power. And they look upon the Jew and they see a white person, or someone who can pass as white, but in their eyes, a white person, who is privileged, even though we know there are many Jews who are not privileged. And in fact, if you control for education, Jews have been able and highly value achieving educational achievement. Jews are exactly where they're supposed to be, but that's for another conversation. But they look upon Jews as white privileged and ipso facto with power. If you're white and you're privileged, you have power. And therefore, it's impossible for you to be a victim of racism or of prejudice, of hatred, of anti-Semitism. And then, you see this explicitly in the British Labour Party, not only in the British Labour Party, but certainly in the British Labour Party. And then you add another element. As Jeremy Corbyn, head of the British Labour Party, always likes to say, my mother protested, demonstrated at Cable Street. In the 30s, there was a very strong fascist element in the United Kingdom, and one of the big demonstrations against them took place on Cable Street. What does he mean when he says, my mother was at Cable Street? What he's saying is, my mother, I imbibed these progressive anti-hate, anti-fascism, anti-prejudicial sentiments with my mother's milk. It's impossible for you to call me a prejudiced person. I couldn't possibly be prejudiced. So therefore, if you couldn't be a victim because you're white and privileged and powerful, and I couldn't be a purveyor of prejudice, then you must be making this up, doing this for ulterior purposes. You want to bring me down politically, you want to achieve your own goals, you want to defend Israel, whatever it might be. It's the only situation where the people I'm describing who are on the progressive left, and again, I'm not describing everyone on the progressive left or attributing this to everyone on the progressive left, who, when they hear a claim of prejudice made by someone from a minority, a racial minority, an ethnic minority, a gender, self-identifying gender minority, whatever it might be, doubts the claim. The default position usually would say, you're a victim, and then you go and check it out. Maybe it was accurate, maybe it wasn't. But here, the default position is, it can't be true. I'll give you an example, and again, using Corbyn as an example because it's so dramatic there. There was a mural, I talk about this in my book. There was a mural painted on the side of a building by a Los Angeles-based artist, invited to paint this by the London local community. And the artist made it quite clear in his statement. He says, I am painting a mural which attacks wealthy Jews. He doesn't say exactly that, but he talks about Rothschilds and others, etc. The mural was of 5, heavy-set, cigar-smoking men with hooked noses, etc., playing Monopoly, and the Monopoly board was held up on the backs of enslaved workers. They were bent over and clearly enslaved. And the artist was quite clear that this was his intention. When the mural went up, even the people in the community, and it was a predominantly Muslim community, thought it was appalling. When it was reported to Jeremy Corbyn, then a backbencher, his first said, oh, no, there's got to be freedom of artistic expression, and you can't go censoring artistic expression, etc. Fast forward a couple of years when he's in the leadership of the Labour Party, and he sees it again, he says, oh, I didn't look closely. I didn't see it closely. And then he says, and no, of course, this is anti-Semitism. Well, my question is, why was his, even if he hadn't looked closely, why was his initial default position, this can't be true, this can't be legitimate? And I can give you many, many others examples of that. again, coming from the left. It's the same kind of anti-Semitism, just coming from two different directions. The third source of this anti-Semitism, particularly on the European continent, is Islamist extremists. Again, not all Muslims, of course not, but amongst them Islamist extremists who have taken to violence. Some of them new arrivals in Europe, some of them born to European parents, etc. But it expresses itself in the same way. And I see an enabling of anti-Semitism by the lack of condemnation of it in this country, by the leadership, in the concurrent leadership of this country. I see it on the left as well, and again using using the Labour Party because it's such a striking example. But there's yet another kind of anti-Semite. I call them the clueless anti-Semites. And I know that sometimes clueless means, seen as a jocular thing. I don't mean it in a jocular, joking fashion at all. It's the person who, well, I'll give you an example. A friend of mine who in the late 60s, early 70s, went to nursing school in New York, and in her, they were put into cohorts, study cohorts, and groups that worked together, and she was the only Jew in her particular cohort, and the other people in the cohort came from the Midwest, smaller towns, had never really interacted with Jews before. My friend happened to come from New York. Her family reached out to her friends and said, you want to come to visit, you want to come Friday night dinners, you want to come for Hanukkah parties, you want to come just to hang out. You're always welcome. Consider this your home away from home. And there was a wonderful relationship. Fast forward to graduation weekend. They're having a lunch together at the cohort, and they're talking about things they will miss in New York because they're all going off to their separate places, to job placements. And one of them was talking about how she's going to miss bargains, that you can get great stores with cut rate prices. And she said, I'm so sad, I just discovered this great store. It's called Loman's. Those of you with a New York background will know it. And here I am graduating, and you can really get terrific bargains there. But before she said that, she turned to my friend, the only Jew at the table, and said, you're really going to be interested in this. And my friend was taken aback. And usually when those kind of things happen, we wake up in the middle of the night at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we sit bolt upright in bed and said, this is what I should have said. But my friend's very quick, and she turned to this other woman and she said, I didn't know Jews were the only ones smart enough to want to save their hard-earned money. Now, the woman who had said it did not have any personal antipathy. But when I say clueless, it's when you have prejudice that is so deep in the weeds that the person engaging in it doesn't even realize that it is prejudice. They're oblivious to it. Again, and on some level, of course, extremism kills people and hurts people and harms people. But on some level, it's a manifestation of a bigger problem, that we're not even attuned to it. And it's the same thing with other prejudice as well. So we see it across the board. Let me mention one other form of prejudice, which I think has become quite complicated in recent years, and that's, of course, of anti-Semitism and its association with the State of Israel. Criticism, and I don't know of any logical person who argues this, but this is often the claim made by people who are critics. If I'm going to criticize the policies of the State of Israel, I'm going to be called an anti-Semite. Simply not true. Criticism of the Israeli policies is not anti-Semitism, and no logical person, I think, would think that way. Maybe some extremists, but not certainly when you go away from the far extreme, you wouldn't find that. In fact, if you want to hear criticisms of Israeli policies, you just had to follow the recent election, or you go to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and you'll hear severe criticism of Israeli policies. Where it crosses the line is where you begin to hear anti-Semitic stereotypes associated with Israel, but a person will say, well, I'm not against Jews, I'm just against Israel because they're too cunning, they're too rich, they're too powerful, or you get what I call, in terms of a form of Holocaust denial, victim, I'm not the only one who calls it, many scholars call it this, victim perpetrator inversion. The Jews are the new Nazis of the Middle East, the genocide of the Palestinians. And by the way, you can disagree with Israelis' policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians on many different accounts. But to talk about a genocide, or to talk about the Israelis as Nazis, is a completely misrepresentation of the case, and it's done quite purposely. Or you can listen to someone, and he's not the only one, but he's been most known about it, the former mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, who likes to talk about how the Zionists and the Nazis worked together. They were in collaboration, and the Nazis provided the Zionists with weapons and set up schools for them and listened to them. It's complete rubbish. Complete rubbish. Has no historical basis. There was one early agreement between a German Zionist organization and the Nazis to help Jews get out of Germany in the summer of 33, and that was it. But he builds that into this giant. But what is he doing? He's trying to link Jews who support Israel, Israelis, with Nazis. It's a form of crossing the line. There's some other more complicated expressions of this. One of the movements that we've seen on a number of campuses is called BDS, Boycott, Divest, Sanction. I happen to think that the movement in the eyes of the organizers, if you look at the organizing papers that are online, calls for the destruction of the State of Israel, calls for the end of the State of Israel, which I claim, you have 6 million Jews living there. I don't know where they're supposed to go. It's a sort of a very flippant kind of explanation, even in terms of, well, they'll say they should live in a state where they'll be a minority, but they'll have rights, etc. I know of no religious minority in any Muslim-dominated state which is thriving. So it's a flippancy. However, having said that, I think there are many people students certainly, who support BDS without fully realizing what the intention is. So it's necessary to take a nuanced view. But much of the criticism is often contextualized in what clearly is anti-Semitic context. And again, it's not criticism of policies, but the way it's contextualized. What then might we do about this? I think there are a number of things. First of all, I think we have to become, and this just doesn't apply to anti-Semitism, because you can't be selectively against one ism. You can't say, I'm going to only worry about this hatred, but not about other hatreds. Yes, if you're of a particular group, a particular minority, whatever, again, racial, ethnic, sexual, whatever it might be, you're going to care more about the one that affects your group. But you can't say, I don't care about the others, they aren't important to me. Because what starts with one group goes to another group. We know that particularly from anti-Semitism, starts with the Jews, never ends with the Jews, or starts with another group, it's going to come back to the Jews, A. B, I think one of the things we have to do, especially moving away from the extremist ends of the spectrum, is become the unwelcome guests at the dinner party. Be willing to speak out. Sometimes you'll show up for Thanksgiving dinner or a holiday dinner or a celebration, and you'll be greeted by your host or your hostess, whomever it might be, who will say, Uncle XYZ is coming, or our cousin is coming, or whatever, and we know that they're an anti-Semite, they're a racist, they're a homophobe, whatever, again, Islamophobe, whatever it might be, and they're likely to say something. Let's just ignore it. We all disagree with it, but we're going to let it pass because we want to have a nice evening. We can't afford, in this day and age, with this atmosphere prevailing in our country of hatred and separation and denigration of groups, we can't do that. We have to speak out. Maybe you have to warn your host that you're going to do this before you do it, but, and speak out hopefully in a constructive fashion. You won't change the minds of the person who is saying these things, but to telegraph a message to the people at the table or at the gathering, particularly the young people, that we don't abide that kind of talk, that that's not acceptable. We also have to remember, growing out of my last comment about telegraphing the message, that no genocide begins with actions. No prejudicial act begins with the action. They always begin with words. Words count. Words matter. Doesn't mean everybody who speaks the words will ultimately engage in a prejudicial act, but those words can hurt. And we know for a fact that every person who engages in a prejudicial act had begun that view with words, had first heard that with words. I think there's one other thing, and I think this is true for all groups that are victims of prejudice and hatred, and certainly for Jews. And that is to fight the tendency, the inclination, to begin to grant the person who hates you victory by seeing yourself through their eyes. I, not long ago, had an experience at Emory. A student who had been my student for a number of years showed up in my office to talk about a paper, and he suddenly was wearing a kippah. And I couldn't quite say to him, hey, what's with the headgear? So I just, went on. We talked about the paper, and towards the end of the conversation, I was walking and said, hey, you notice I was wearing a kippah? I said, oh yeah, hey, what is that? How come? And he said, well, I've been so disturbed by anti-Semitic incidents happening around the world that I want to wear a kippah to demonstrate that I'm a Jew. Now, on one hand, I was very proud that he, as a Jew to a Jew, I was proud, even if I wasn't a Jew, that here was someone wanting to affirm their identity in the face of people who would be prejudiced against him. On the other hand, my heart was broken, because what had brought him to affirm that identity? Hatred and contempt. And it's too easy, and again, I say this applies to many groups, but in this case I'm talking about anti-Semitism and Jews. It's too easy to let yourself become objectified, to be turned into object rather than subject. To say, I'm all about, and I'm concerned only about what is done to Jews and not what Jews do. That I am going to identify as a Jew or whatever, again, whatever it might be, not despite the anti-Semite, but because of the anti-Semite. If you do that, you cede to the oppressor control over your identity. You feel strongly as an X when the hater is out there. When the hater isn't there, you feel like, whatever you want to feel like. And certainly in terms of Jewish identity, Jewish culture, there's so much richness to it. In all its manifestations, religious, cultural, artistic, philanthropic, historical, that to let the oppressor determine who you are and what you are, and when you are, or when you feel like you are, is giving them way too much power and giving yourself, shortchanging yourself. And the final point I want to make about hate in general, and again, speaking specifically about anti-Semitism, one of the reasons to fight it so strongly, certainly if you're a Jew, just like as in any other minority group, it's your ox who's being gored, speaking figuratively, you're going to respond more strongly. It's understandable and it's completely legitimate. But that's not a sufficient reason to fight it or be concerned about it. And certainly maybe you have relatives, grandchildren, in-laws, whatever it might be, neighbors whom you care about greatly, who are of this particular group, and you see them being attacked and you feel that hurts you. Or you hate all forms of prejudice and feel really motivated by that. That too, but none of those are sufficient reasons. The reason really to be worried about all forms of prejudice, and in this case specifically anti-Semitism, is that, again, First of all, they sow divisions between groups. They sow hatred between groups. And in terms of anti-Semitism, if you become an anti-Semite, you are an anti-Semite. And there's no such thing as being a little bit prejudiced. You know, it's like being a little bit pregnant. You either are or you aren't, you know. But if you ascribe to that, you're ascribing to a conspiracy theory. Oh, well, the media is not fair, it's controlled by Jews. The banks are not fair, they're controlled by Jews. The government is not fair, it's controlled by Jews. The minute you ascribe to this lack of faith in our democratic institutions, our democracy is at risk. So, whomever you care about, whatever group you come from, this hatred, this prejudice, this division we are seeing today, not just in our country, but worldwide, is something that should be of concern to all of us. The job to fight it is great. The time is short, and the need to act is now. Thank you very much. Are we doing questions? People, I don't know. Lisa, are we doing questions? People have questions? I'm happy to answer them. Come on. There must be some questions. Huh? Yes, please, back there.
What gave you the idea to use a particular format that you use in your book?
Okay. In my book, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, I use the format of letters. Letters between me and a student who happens to be Jewish and a colleague who is not Jewish. To tell you the truth, I started to write the book and I couldn't put my head around how to do it. First I was doing it country by country. You know, you had to be an expert in so many aspects, it just didn't work. Then I was doing it by period, and it just didn't work. To tell you the truth, it was boring. I was falling asleep writing it, and I said, my reader, if I can't stand him. Finally, a friend said to me, try letters. And letters is an old-time format, and so I started to create these characters, and I created a Jewish character and a non-Jewish character. And here's the irony. Often you go and you hear, you go to a movie based on history, or the characters are real characters, but what comes out of them, if you watch The Queen, it's coming back, the next season is coming back, or whatever. What's coming out of their mouth is fiction. We're all going to go see Downton Abbey, the movie, fiction, but we love the costumes. But here, the characters are composites, though I've had lots of students come up to me and said, I'm so thrilled you based it on me. It's not it's based on a whole composite of questions I've gotten from my students on my campus, other campuses, and same thing from colleagues. But everything that comes out of their mouth, the questions they ask, how do you define anti-Semitism? How do I recognize anti-Semitism? I had this incident at a seminar. Was that anti-Semitic? Was it ignorance? What was it? Are all things that I've heard that are real. So the characters are fictional, but the comments they make are real. And the reason I'm so pleased with when I hit upon it and worked it out is because I want this book, and it's, you know, it seems to have happened. I just told in one of your classes here in YSU, it's been used to be accessible. I wasn't writing for 12 other academics, but I wanted it to be accessible, and yet, as I point out to people who talk about its accessibility, you know, it's so nice you made it accessible. Sometimes academics, you know, if you can write accessibly, if you can write so someone else understands it, lots of academics think you're not being scholarly. That's their problem. But it has 30 pages of footnotes. So I sought for that composite to reach a larger audience with an academic presentation. I saw another hand up. Do I see anyone else?
I was going to ask a question about denial.
Sure. The movie or the topic?
The topic. Well, what happened?
Okay.
So we know what happened in the movie, but...
The movie is the movie Denial with Rachel Weisz. You know, people sometimes play it at dinner parties or, who do you want to play you in the movie? Whenever people start that, I said, been there, done that. So now I make them play, what do you want as an epitaph? Maybe it's because I'm getting older, you know. The movie is pretty accurate. It's based on my book. The producers and the writer of the screenplay, David Hare, who is arguably one of, is certainly Britain's greatest screenplay writers, were understood, and I talked to them about this before I signed the final option, that this is a movie about truth and the prevalence of truth, and that there are things that are true and there are things that are false. It's not all relative and fungible, etc. And that they had to stick to it, and they did. Everything that is spoken in courtroom scenes was actually spoken in the courtroom. The fact of the bigger thing, I think, is that when he sued me, and as those of you who've seen the movie, you know, that libel law in the United Kingdom is the mirror opposite of libel law in the United States. In the United States, if I say you libeled me, I have to prove you libeled me. In England, if I say what you wrote about me is libel, you, as the author, have to prove the truth of what you said. So therefore, if I hadn't fought him, he would have won by default. If I hadn't fought, Penguin would have settled probably, but because I was fighting, Penguin couldn't settle. But our intention was not to prove the Holocaust. We didn't want this to become a did the Holocaust happen trial, because that would have been a false victory even if we had won, because you don't have did World War II happen, did the Korean War happen, you know, did the Civil War happen, or as where I come from, parts of the South call it the war between the states, you know. But you don't have those kind of trials. What we wanted was to prove that this man is a liar. This man who is the leading Holocaust denier, this man who produces the stuff that other deniers use, that when he says, I have a document that proves XYZ, he doesn't have it. Or he's taken a document and he's misinterpreted, misread it. So what we did, and for the historians here and the students of history, we followed his footnotes back to his sources. And we showed that in virtually every time, he said, I have a document which shows Hitler wanted to stop the destruction of the Jews. Well, that's depicted in the movie. He called for the end. He said, Judentransport aus Berlin, keine liquidieren. One trainload of Jews from Berlin, do not liquidate. So first of all, that proves to you that there's liquidation going on. If I say that group of kids should not be going to, as I said, to the basketball game, it proves that there is a basketball game, you know? Number one. Number two, it was one train, singular. But when he writes about it, Hitler ordered that the destruction of the Jews should not happen. So we showed over and over again that when he went back to the beginning, to his documents, when we went back to his documents, there was a falsification, an invention, a change of date, etc. But we did something else which was also very important to me. We proved his deep-seated racism. He talked once about being on vacation, turning on the BBC, and seeing one of them reading our news to us. He was giving a speech, and we had the tape of the speech. The court gave us access to his tapes. And he named a newsreader, a BBC newsreader, who was a man from the Caribbean. He was born in England, his parents were from the Caribbean. A black man, one of them reading. And he turned to the judge, as my lawyer was questioning him, and said, oh, your lordship, Mr. Rampton is trying to prove that I'm a racist. I wasn't talking about black people, I was talking about women. Made it okay, you know, to see one of them reading it. But we showed over and over again his racism and his misogyny, because so often these things, anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, are just part of a package whole. We won, as was mentioned, the judge declaring him a neo-Nazi polemicist who engages in racism, anti-Semitism, etc. And whose view of history is fallacious, and who does, these aren't mistakes, he does this deliberately. I could have at that point gone after him for my costs, But I decided I didn't want to do that. I didn't want, he still says it anyway, but I didn't want him going around saying, you know, I am rich Deborah Lipstadt, she stole my money from me, etc. So I walked away, and after 2 appeals, I just walked away and said, I'm not going for costs. So, and what's happened to him now, I really don't know. I mean, I know he's around and he says things, I don't follow him. He took 6 years of my life, 7 years of my life. That's enough. So, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lipstadt, for visiting our community and for providing us with such a very informative presentation. We realize that anti-Semitism is with us every day in our lives. As you said, we need to recognize it, learn it, and be able to speak out and fight anti-Semitism with all of our strength. I thank you very much.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Jewish Federation of Youngstown, I would like to present to you a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
I am pleased to report that we've had a strong start to the campaign thanks to those who had the generous forethought to create a perpetual annual campaign endowment or Lion of Judah endowment. More than $96,000 of the total of the campaign has been raised in 2018. These legacy gifts allow donors to maintain their support of the Federation for generations to come. To create a lasting legacy, please contact Lisa Long, the Financial Resource Development Director. With sincere gratitude to Terry and Steve Anderson, Lorene and Jerry Canast, and Rochelle and Sam Miller for chairing this event. Henry Canast, who passed away earlier this year, was one of the last remaining survivors of the Holocaust in our community. His legacy will forever be immortalized in that large wall photograph that you will see at Yad Vashem, should you visit Yad Vashem, where he is seen liberated with others from the concentration camp Buchenwald. And Bill Vey spent many years of his life teaching high school students and adults alike the realities of the Holocaust. Videotapes of his interviews in which Bill describes vividly and in graphic detail of the horrors he and others witnessed and suffered through are as or more emotionally compelling, in my opinion, than the Academy Award-winning Schindler's List. Once again, we thank you very much. The Federation's campaign is the bread and butter that helps our local agencies operate, as well as fund critical programs and services in Israel and in 70 countries worldwide. When you are contacted for your 2019 pledge, please think about the stories you heard tonight and remember our community's legacy. We are a community of survivors. There are several ways to grow your support this year. Please take advantage of 2 matches. The Thomas's Family Endowment has once again set up a challenge fund. There is up to $60,000 available, which can only be achieved with your active participation. When you are contacted by Federation or lay leadership, please accept their offer to meet in person. This easy acceptance will not only build relationships and community, but will also earn $200. Please consider increasing your gift. The Thomases will match each increased dollar for dollar up to $18,000. The Federation has also once again secured a place in the Youngstown Foundation's Support Fund. For all gifts of $100 or more, The foundation will add 10% to the first $5,000 of your gift. Please see the back page of the brochure you were given at entry for instructions, or ask Lisa Long for more information. Plus, as well, for each gift made through Youngstown Foundation, the Thomas's Family Endowment will match these as well, dollar for dollar, up to $10,000. I thank you all for coming tonight and for your part in ensuring our community's lifelong legacy. Thank you and good night.